Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, as leaders of West African countries discuss the military coup in Mali and the regional bloc ECOWAS suspends Mali, closes its borders and considers imposing sanctions, an army colonel, Assimi Goita, emerges as the new military leader. But some analysts argue that what Mali needs is a Marshall Plan, not a military regime. We'll speak to the former Nigerian Senator, Shehu Sani, who served as the Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs and who's developed some expertise on Mali's problems. And later, a former top official of the United Nations who attained the rank of UN Assistant Secretary General as well as Registrar of the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Dr. Okoli, joins me from Lagos to discuss his latest project, a global campaign to rid the English language of words and phrases with racist origins and undertones, which he says are used to discriminate and dominate. Dr. Agwu Ukiwe Okali, coming up in a moment. Now, for months, the people of Mali, fed up with a government unable to effectively rule a country beset by a brutal jihadist conflict, communal violence, and a shattered economy, have demanded that the president resign. Under the banner of the June 5 movement, a broad coalition of opposition parties, religious leaders, and civil society groups, they protested against President Keita's 2018 re-election, claiming it was plagued by irregularities and denouncing the government's efforts to fill the Supreme Court with loyalists. The situation further deteriorated when the military killed 11 protesters. The Keita government was simply unacceptable to many Malians who were forced to flee their homes to escape jihadist and communal violence. The government's incapacity was further illustrated by its inability or unwillingness to secure the release of presidential candidate and opposition leader Soumaïla Cissé, who was kidnapped by jihadists last March. Fearing state collapse, ECOWAS proposed a unity government, but that wasn't enough for the protesters. They rejected the ECOWAS proposals and brought the protesters back into the streets to demand the president's resignation. When that didn't happen, the military struck. So what next for Mali? Well, the former Nigerian Senator Shehu Sani served as Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs. He has considerable expertise on Mali's problems, and he joins me now in the studio. Delighted to have you here, sir.
Thank you for having me.
What do you make of the leaders of the military coup in Mali saying, first of all, calling on civil servants to return to work and saying that they're looking to the future to now set up a civilian government and hold elections?
Thank you once again. Well, what is happening in Mali is a continuation of the crisis, the storms, and the turbulence we have been facing in the West African sub-region in the last 4 decades. Most times when there is crisis and a civilian regime is facing serious internal opposition and the country is tottering to collapse, usually you see this messianic intervention by the military to restore order and peace, as they have always said. And almost all countries in the West African sub-region were once under military rule, and the cases that have always incited the military takeover has always been the same. Usually rigged election, crisis, chaos, failure of peace talks, failure of foreign intervention, and then the military become the last option. So what we have seen with the new military junta in the country is more or less defying the pressure and the threats that comes from the sub-region, and saying that we have taken over and we are digging in, and we have established ourselves as a government, and if you want to deal with us, you deal with us as a government, and this is our country. So it is now left for the regional force to either dialogue with the military administration or to confront it, and in both cases it comes with consequences.
Right. Well, we're waiting. We're going to hear from ECOWAS and what they're hoping to do. There's been talk of imposing sanctions and so on. But you raised some very interesting points there, because I wonder if there is a question to answer about why, when a government goes rogue on its own people, the world sits by and does nothing when it has the mandate to stop governments abusing their own people, and they don't do anything until the army intervenes. And then there's this sudden sort of noise.
Well, you are not even generalizing it to the world as a concept, but you can narrow it to Africa and West African sub-region. There has been this trend and this attitude of solidarity within leaders, African leaders, and you see the habit of endorsing, accepting rigged elections, and even congratulating winners, and it will always be referred to as the internal affairs of that country. If you look at the trend of elections in Africa, whenever elections are conducted, if you see bodies that have always faulted elections are usually perhaps those that comes outside of Africa and perhaps local civil society groups. But African governments almost endorses every elections until it turns to a crisis. So what we have seen in Mali is more of an election that was perceived by the people of the country to be rigged in 2018, and a June 5 movement was established, and protest was going on, and the failure of diplomacy now begets what you have a military takeover. So as far as Mali is concerned, it is the continuous narrative of what happens in terms of failure of civil and democratic administration, and the reasons why the military have always taken over. In 1983, if you can remember, part of the reasons why the military struck in Nigeria was that the elections was rigged, and crisis came with the opposition party raising issues about it, and then it's there. And even with the coming of General Sani Abacha in 1993 too, it also came with the rigged election of 1993 June. So if you go by the trend of what has been happening in the West African sub-region as far as military takeover is concerned, that has always been the case. And the question is that African leaders, should they simply continue to fold their arms and those rigged elections, and when crisis comes, then condemn military takeover? Because rigging elections and taking over power in form of coup are almost the same thing.
Right.
It is one
and of
that
course we're
one.
having issues now in Ivory Coast and other places and so on, where the government wants to, the president wants to run for a third term.
Yes.
But nevertheless, in a country or in a region that's been afflicted by so many military coups, are there red lines that should never be crossed? Is there ever justification for a military intervention? I mean, you're a Democrat yourself. You were in the Senate, a member of the vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I mean, you dealt with all these countries, you dealt with many governments. Is there ever justification for military intervention?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I don't believe in military rule, and there should be no justification for that.
I mean, you're one of the people who fought against military rule.
We suffered under military rule. Yeah. Because what comes, the military always come into office on the pretense of restoring peace and order, and with a promise or pledges of restoring democratic rule within the shortest possible of time. But the moment they entrench themselves, then you will see an open betrayal of that promise, a treachery of all they have said, and then they would like to dig in. So, if the options that are on the table here is, do you have a civilian democratic administration that is presiding over chaos and crisis and unable to address the problems of the country, or do you need a military rule for a brief period of time that will restore peace and order? But from what we have seen in history, as far as West Africa is concerned, hardly do the military live up to their expectations in terms of living up to their word. Very few of them.
Right.
So now, the leaders of the West African sub-region will have to walk by the political temperature in Mali.
Right. So what
if
do
the
you
people
think?
of Mali
Right.
welcome the new administration with the promise of restoring order, then there is very little any outside force can do as far as an alternative.
Right, but that's from the outside.
Yes.
I mean, you have some familiarity and considerable expertise on the history and politics of Mali. Do you trust the fact that the coup leaders say they're going to hold elections sooner rather than later and hand over to a civilian government, or don't you trust them?
And it is difficult to trust any military administration, but it is possible to put them on check as far as the West African leaders are concerned. And what is needed now is, first of all, to engage them and then to pin them down to their words. If it is impossible to return Ibrahim back to power.
Right,
Ibrahim Boubacar Keita back to power. So now they need to engage them. And when you engage them, then there should be a clear schedule and timetable. This is what is going to happen. And if this doesn't happen, this is what we're going to do. So, but in the case of trusting the military, it's a very difficult thing to do. Because as we have seen, they too, the leaders, the African leaders, are themselves weak. Many of them have credibility and moral problems. They rig themselves into office, and they are also in the habit of crushing opposition. They have a stewardship and record of gross human rights violations, and also many of those countries are facing serious political crises that we are not able to solve. So those that will have been on a strong moral footing to ensure that the promise of democracy is kept by the military junta, they too have a reputation problem.
Well,
which you also have to look at that.
That's very, very interesting.
Yes.
Former Senator Shehu Sani, I want to thank you very much indeed for coming in. And of course, Shehu Sani served as Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs.